Daniel looked. There was no mistaking Kurt's large houndstooth overcoat. Why would he do that? Go without his coat or bag? Martin poked half-heartedly at the solidifying eggs. Peter shrugged. It happens. Despair. A sense of hopelessness. Who knows, perhaps he felt betrayed. He looked at Daniel, then at Martin. Just like you must have felt when. He paused, raised his hand to cover his mouth in mock horror, looking from Daniel to Rick. To Martin. Oh dear. I'm afraid I've said too much. Rick's face colored. He stared at his feet. Martin seemed confused. What are you talking about? Suicide, Daniel said quickly. To his right, Marcus had gone still, although he never lifted his eyes from his magazine. Peter thinks he threw himself overboard while we were all sleeping. Oh. Bacon sizzled. Martin looked uncomfortable, but Daniel knew him well enough to know he wouldn't press the issue. If nothing, he was circumspect. Later, perhaps, when he and Rick were alone, Marcus frowned and flipped pages of his magazine roughly with his right hand, exaggerating the sound. His left hand lay next his thigh, clenched in a fist. Daniel looked at Kurt's coat, then turned his attention to the scene outside the window. He'd been wrong. Despite the illusion of improved visibility that morning brought, the snow hadn't really let up at all. If anything, it had grown worse. The weather still crept towards them down the hills and across the frozen lake, closing in on them with the inevitability of fate. Over post-breakfast mimosas, Peter announced the start of the second round of the game. The session moved quickly, the arguments brief and to the point. Peter alluded to the handy survival tips he'd picked up during his brief, ignoble stint in the Boy Scouts. Martin, not his usual voluble self, briefly touted his culinary skills with whatever seafood they might catch. As a teenager, Rick had worked a fishing sloop one summer and claimed he could supply Martin with a steady supply of fish. Having once read a survivalist book, Marcus declared himself capable of rigging up a solar water collector. Jason promised to satisfy every sexual whim of whoever might survive this round. He leered at Peter, and then it was Daniel's turn. He felt disoriented, couldn't think. Kurt's disappearance hung over him like a pall. He glanced at Marcus, who stared back blithely. Well? Peter tapped his pencil on the arm of his chair. He looked bored. Daniel couldn't come up with what he felt was a convincing argument. In a cramped boat, he began, disputes are bound to arise. He stopped. About food, water, relationships? Peter added. Daniel ignored him. You need me because you need a level-headed mediator whom everyone can trust to impartially resolve disputes. To his owners, his argument sounded weak and irrational. Peter handed out the slips of paper and pencils. To Daniel's surprise, he passed the toque to Marcus. As the newest member of our esteemed group, here Peter paused and glanced significantly at Daniel. You can collect the votes. Marcus took the hat with a stiff nod. A tic had developed in his right cheek. They scribbled, then dropped their votes in the hat as Marcus held it out. Daniel couldn't meet his gaze when he deposited his. Marcus reached in and unfolded them one by one. Jason, 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 Jason. 6 votes against. Marcus smiled. Bullshit. A vein throbbed on Jason's forehead. I didn't vote. Against myself. He looked desperately at the circle of faces. You're all out to get me. His outrage was no surprise. Histrionics were his stock in trade. Although Daniel had extricated himself from their brief relationship, in the privacy of Jason's house, Jason had engineered a public scene. The next day, accosting him in an outdoor cafe, making it clear to anyone in earshot that it was he who was dispensing with Daniel. He seated Jason his small spectacle, hoping that it would be the last he'd have to endure of him. Until this weekend, he'd been largely successful. You cheated. Rising, Jason snatched the toque from Marcus' hand, turning it inside out. It was empty, quivering like an agitated terrier. Jason glared at Marcus. He rigged it. We all watched him. He didn't do anything. Peter smiled, clearly amused by the turn of events. You shit. Jason pointed his finger at Marcus. I voted against you. Where's my vote? He swung around to face Daniel. They're both and on it. Daniel's still trying to spite me for the way I humiliated him when we broke up. Daniel's temper flared. He wanted to smash Jason in the mouth, to hammer the words back down his throat. But it was too late. Marcus stared at Jason with narrowed, baleful eyes. Daniel swallowed, looked down at the table, his anger dissipating as quickly as it had risen, fear washing it away. Marcus knew. Christ, what would he do? It's not fair. Peter rose and walked over to the mantel. He rested his hand significantly on the cigar box. Your history. Jason shook with fury. For a moment Daniel thought he might make more of a scene than Barry had, that he wouldn't have the good grace to depart with what little dignity he had left. But then he stomped off to his room, collected his overnight bag, and exited with only the slightest of whimpers. He didn't even slam the door. Just like that, another part of Daniel's past was gone. A few minutes later, someone remarked they hadn't heard Jason's car start. As it turned out, no one had. Peter, mixing up the day's first batch of margaritas, eyed Daniel. Be a good chap and check to see if his car is gone, will you? I don't much care for the thought of him lurking around outside. Daniel went to the window. It's gone. Good. 3 empty spaces. Barry, Kurt, Jason. Jason's was a fresh wound. Kurt's had almost filled in, his tire tracks now merely shallow ruts. Daniel blinked, looked again. There were no new tire tracks on the drive. No tracks at all leading from Jason's spot. But his vehicle wasn't there. It was as if the hand of a malicious god had plucked his car from the earth and hurled it into the void. Daniel's stomach knotted. When he turned, he found Marcus observing him from the far end of the couch, as distant from the other members of the group as was humanly possible, with a steady, uninflected gaze. Good riddance, Marcus said, his words echoing Jason's own. After Barry's departure, and then he crossed his arms and turned to stare out the window at the approaching wall of white, willing it, or so it seemed to Daniel, to hasten towards them and smother the past, erasing it forever. Why shouldn't we throw you overboard? Peter rolled the stem of his wine glass between his fingers, as if he were rolling around the question. He observed Marcus through the bowl, the legs of his Chardonnay descending in long, parabolic arcs. It was early afternoon, and the third round was drawing to a close. Marcus, the last to justify his continued existence. He hadn't spoken to Daniel since Jason's departure, had studiously ignored him, even when Daniel had tried to catch his attention. Still on the couch, away from the card table, he stared outside as thick flakes of snow blew across the porch and ticked on the windowsill, growing miniature drifts. Visibility had shrunk to 20 meters. I'm with Daniel, Marcus answered, as if that was more than enough, never taking his eyes from the scene outside. Daniel was astonished. That's it? Martin asked. Marcus turned to face the group. Yes. It's your funeral, Peter said. Time to vote. Marcus rose and walked to the table to collect his slip and pencil. They all scribbled, cupping their hands to hide what they were writing. Daniel thought about Jason's altered vote, about the missing tire tracks, about Kurt's disappearance. He moved his pencil, but left the slip blank, putting a tiny crease in the corner with his thumbnail. Picking up the toque, he stuffed his vote in. This round, he'd volunteered to be a numerator. Daniel held out the toque to the others. One by one they deposited their votes, Daniel watching them carefully, making sure their hands stayed well outside the hat. He removed the slips and read out the names. 2 Ricks, 1 Martin, 1 Peter, and 1 Daniel. The slip bearing his name had a tiny crease in the corner. He felt sick. Well, Peter said, looking at Marcus strangely, it's not exactly the result I expected. But tyranny of the ignorant and all that. Rick blanched, unprepared for the outcome he'd arrived with. Martin and had probably not contemplated having to leave without him. They'd driven up in Martin's SUV, and now Martin would have to shuttle Rick to the bus station, really a bus stop outside a general store 40 miles away. I think the snow's letting up, Daniel lied. The 4x4 should be okay. Marcus rose, went into the kitchen, and began rooting around in the fridge. Sorry, Peter said. You know the rules. Rick looked like a lost child. No one said a word. In silence, he collected his kit and slouched to the door. Martin joined him a moment later. Daniel watched from the corner, his arms folded over his chest. Peter still sat at the card table where he shuffled and dealt himself a hand of solitaire, cards clicking in the silence. It was a solemn, almost mournful air. In the kitchen, Marcus sliced onions on the cutting board, making himself a sandwich. Martin and Rick pulled on their boots and coats. Martin opened the door and stepped out. Pausing on the threshold, Rick looked back and, affecting a false bravado, said, "See you all in hell." The door banged shut behind them. Daniel hurried over to the window, watched Martin climb into the driver's side of his 4x4 while Rick loaded his suitcase in the back seat. Daniel didn't want to take his eyes off them for a second, afraid that if he did, what? They might disappear? It was absurd. Yet, he couldn't shake the fear. He watched as Rick climbed in next to Martin. A familiar touch on his shoulder, he twisted away, snatching his overcoat from a hook. "Going somewhere? I need some air." "It won't matter." Daniel buttoned his coat, pulled on his boots, his sense of urgency growing. Marcus gripped his shoulder with surprising strength. "Don't go." Shrugging free of Marcus's grip, he hurried out the door. Martin was backing out, his vehicle leaving crisp tire prints in the snow. The temperature had dropped, and the snowfall blotted out everything. Beyond a radius of about 10 meters, Daniel shivered, his breath unfurling before him. The windows of the 4x4 were lightly fogged, but Daniel could make them out, Martin holding the wheel with his left hand, working the clutch with his right, Rick sitting next to him, fiddling with the radio. The car backed into the drive until its nose pointed towards the road that climbed into the hills. It wasn't 2 meters away. Daniel raised his hand to wave goodbye. Martin waved back. Then he leaned forward and rubbed a small circle on the fogged windshield. It clouded over within seconds. He rubbed again with no better results. Everywhere else, the gray moisture coating the windows thickened. Martin became less distinct, Rick a dark blotch. On his other side, flicking the controls on the front panel, perhaps trying to get their blower to work. Martin reached towards his door. He seemed to be pressing the window button, but the window didn't budge. Daniel lost sight of Rick altogether. The hum of the engine changed as the 4x4 slipped into gear. The car lurched forward uncertainly, like a novice driver was at the wheel. Only Rick's hands weren't on the wheel. They were flat on the plane of the window, trying to pull it down. Then his fists pounded the glass, the meaty part of his palms leaving momentary smears that fogged up. As soon as he pulled his hands away, muffled sounds reached Daniel. The revving engine, the pounding, what could have been screams. A plume of exhaust filled the air as the car slowly accelerated away. Helpless, Daniel stood rooted. The 4x4 moved up the road, fading. The horn tooted twice, the way one would signal a cheery goodbye. And then it was gone, lost to sight, thick sheets of snow folding around it like a shroud. "Love you." Marcus stood next to Daniel as if he had materialized. There, he stuck his hands in the pockets of his overcoat. "You love me?" Cold crept into Daniel's coat underneath his collar when made his eyes tear up. Shivering, he wrapped his arms around himself. "Please, Daniel, I need to know." "Yes," he whispered, the porch seeming to spin beneath his feet. "Of course I do." Behind him, the screen door banged shut. Marcus was gone, the space next to Daniel empty, as if Marcus had never been there in the first place. "He's had plenty of time to drive to town and back," Peter said. "Let's get on with it." Marcus dried the last plate and placed it in the dish rack. Dinner had come and gone. The portion left for Martin had long grown cold, been wrapped and tucked away in the fridge. Daniel stood by the window, staring at the white that pressed. And on the cabin, beyond the edge of the porch, nothing was visible. It was as if they floated in a void, with no proof the rest of the world still existed. Let's give him just a few more minutes. He had no plan, no ideas, other than to defer the start of the next round as long as possible. Marcus took a seat at the table opposite Peter. He eyed Daniel. "No," Peter said. "Get your wrinkly ass over here." "I'll tell him," Daniel thought. What I saw, what Marcus did. But he knew Peter wouldn't believe it. And even if he could convince him, what then? Try to escape, like Kurt had? At the thought of leaving Marcus, Daniel's resolve crumpled. He hadn't the will. "I love him," he thought, "and am frightened of him." He tried to smile at Marcus to reassure him that whatever had happened or was happening was okay. But Marcus only stared back without expression. "Martin's dead," Peter said decisively. "One of those couple things, I suppose. You know, one partner dies and the other follows shortly after with a broken heart." He stuck his finger in his mouth and made a retching sound. Too cliched, but Martin was never one to shy away from cliche. He smiled. "But then love makes fools of us all, doesn't it?" Marcus stared blankly at Peter. Without malice, Daniel wanted to believe, but couldn't. "The next round begins now." If you don't want to play, then pack your things and leave. Daniel felt dizzy. Beneath him, his legs worked, managed to negotiate the distance. Then he was sitting. The toque lay in the middle of the table. You go first. He looked at Peter, about to plead for another delay, and realized, up close, how elated Peter looked, hunched over, hands in lap, eyes sunken and dark, as if he hadn't slept in days. Jesus. Peter, you look like shit. Fuck how I look. Raising his right hand from his lap, he pointed the snout of his gun at Daniel. State your case. Daniel was transfixed. Perhaps you'd better. Marcus's voice was even, unperturbed, as if he were urging a trip to the market. Peter had had the gun all along. It wasn't Marcus, hadn't been. Marcus. Daniel opened his mouth and snapped it shut. His mind raced in maddening circles. He couldn't take his eyes off the small, dark O of the weapon's bore. Last chance. Peter cocked the gun. I don't want to die. Not terribly convincing, but okay. That hadn't been his reason. Daniel wanted to stop things, or at least slow them down. Instead, the scene seemed to accelerate, unfolding with horrifying speed. All right, Peter said, my go. He smiled crookedly. So here's why I shouldn't be cast overboard, Daniel, even though you may not know it, I love you. Love you? Daniel was astounded. Isn't that stupid? Peter shook his head, as if at his own folly. I don't suppose that's enough, but it's all I have. He swung the gun on. Marcus, your turn. I love him, too, Marcus said, and I think he loves me. Peter nodded, as if he understood. But what the hell did he understand? Time to vote. With his free hand, Peter pushed the slips of paper towards them. Marcus scribbled. Peter did the same, writing awkwardly with his left hand, using the butt of the gun to keep the paper from moving. They put their votes in the toque. Neither made an attempt to hide what they'd written from Daniel. They'd voted against each other. I don't understand. Daniel felt like he was in shock. Vote. Peter swung the gun on him. That's what it's always been about, Marcus said. You have to choose. Do it. Perspiration had collected on Peter's forehead. He ran his finger up and down the trigger. Daniel looked from one to the other, Peter's eyes tinged with madness, Marcus's unfathomable. Then he stared at the empty slip of paper. The pen was leaden in his hand. Peter reached across the table, placing the metal snout of the gun on Daniel's temple. You'd best do as he says, Daniel. Jesus fucking Christ. They were crazy, both of them. Make your choice. Peter ground the barrel into Daniel's temple. Please, Marcus said, for me. Cupping his hands so they couldn't see, Daniel scrawled in small letters his own name, Daniel, and added his slip to the hat. Now empty it, Peter said, the pressure from the gun unrelenting. Daniel reached for the toque and appended it. A slip fell out, then another. Then half a dozen all at once, more and more, hundreds of slips fluttering from the maw of the hat, falling like thick clotting flakes of snow, until a mound formed in the center of the table. Still more slips tumbled out and accumulated in drifts, swirled, slipping over the edge to float into Daniel's lap and then tumbled gently to the floor. And each slip was identical, inscribed in large, black letters with the same name, over and over. Peter. Daniel heard a strangled gasp. The gun tumbled to the table, settled into the rat's nest of paper. He turned. Peter was gone, his seat empty. He and Marcus were alone at the table. The snowstorm dwindled, then petered out altogether. The world was fresh, unsullied. Daniel stood at the side of the cabin, gathering logs from the woodpile until his arms were full. He turned. Sunlight glittered on the new fall, stung his eyes, making it bearable only for the briefest time. In front of the cabin, the cars were gone, all of them, even Daniel's. As if they never existed. There was no sign of the drive or of the service road. Trees had filled in those spaces. Is this the same world or a new one? Daniel wondered. There was no way of telling. He trudged back through the drifts and climbed onto the front porch. Shouldering open the door, Daniel stamped the snow from his boots, walked the logs across the room and piled them on the andirons. Marcus sat in the corner, a blanket over his shoulders, playing with the gun, spinning the cylinder idly, his breath forming tenuous clouds. The electricity had gone with Peter, as had their phone and everything that ran on batteries. Daniel tore pages out of Old magazines, crumpled them, and shoved them under the logs along with the bit of kindling they had. He struck a match. Even though the lights wouldn't work, the logs caught obligingly. "There," Daniel said wearily. "That should help." They had enough logs to keep themselves alive for 2 weeks. Maybe more. If they're rationed, the food might last even longer. "Do you love me?" Marcus asked. The constant question was an annoyance, a background hum that wouldn't go away. But Daniel smiled obligingly and answered, "Yes." It was the new game. That love would sustain them, keep them from vanishing like the others. It was their lifeboat. Promise. His steady assurances had done nothing to ameliorate Marcus's need, to blunt his jealousy and fear. He's scared, Daniel thought. Been scared all along of not being loved. "Of course I do." Marcus scrutinized him, seemed to be weighing the sincerity of his words. Daniel tried to smile reassuringly. It's not his fault, Daniel tried to convince himself. Not completely. Didn't I wish for it, too? For them all to go away? Hasn't he only been doing what I'd wanted all along? Marcus turned, stared out the window, spun the cylinder again. "And me?" Daniel asked, his heart tripping in his chest. "Do you love me? So much it hurts." Daniel let out his breath. He wanted to believe Marcus. After all, he was still here, the smell of burning wood in his nose, the spreading warmth of the fire creeping into his legs, a tingle in his arms left over from the weight of the logs. Alive. But would Marcus love him? Forever? Or was it only a matter of time before Daniel, too, would vanish, another distasteful memory erased? A man in love, it seemed, must learn to live with uncertainty. Sitting with his back against the headboard of the bed, he is struck by the way the moonlight slides obliquely through the window and across the back of Naomi's calves and shoulders, framing her. Black lines of shadow cast by the mountains divide her body into 12 unequal planes of light. He considers them, imagining the feel and texture each holds, a sculpted forearm, the plateau of her small shoulder blade, the slight curve of her hip, lingering on each extent, until he learns it, knows it better than he knows those regions of his own body. Sheets lie rumpled around her, between them, bunched, where she has pushed them away in her sleep. In this half-light, the tiny patterns of chrysanthemums she likes so well are invisible. She stirs, rolls onto her back. Her body is compact, narrow hips, and small, jutting breast with large nipples that cast thin shadows in the moonlight. Her hair is cropped close to the skull and dyed black. She is small and naked and perfect, and he feels his desire stirring. He wants to reach out and touch her, to run his forefinger between her breasts, around them, imagines his hand a skiff drifting lightly across the surface of her skin. Leaning forward, he extends his arm, breaking into her light, shadow fingers hovering, about to descend, then stops, hand suspended as night is sundered. A thin trail of fire outside his window, slicing from sky to earth, swallowed by the desert. A meteorite, he thinks, the afterimage still burning across his retina. Outside, the sand glows silver in the moonlight, and beyond a low hill he believes he can still make out a soft, inviting radiance where the finger of light has touched. "Ron." Naomi's voice is distant, sleep-filled. He answers, struggling into his jeans. "Where are you going?" "Out for a drive," he says. "I can't sleep." "Oh." She is awake now, propped on her elbows, watching him with large, brown eyes as if she is studying him. "Would you like some company?" "No," he says sharply, immediately regretting his tone, softening. "No. Thanks anyway. I need some time alone." He smiles, a lopsided thing, hoping to disguise his annoyance at her intrusion and the sudden spur of guilt he experiences for refusing her company. She stares at him a moment, blinks, rolls over, leaving him, feeling as if he should make some amends. He is about to tell her he is sorry about the light he has seen, perhaps invite her along. But her back is a wall whose purpose he cannot fathom. Instead, he grabs his shirt from where it lays on a chair, pulls it on, steps quickly through the house and out the front door, the screen door banging against its aluminum frame. The moon has set and it is dark. He is driving away from the ranch house towards the spine of mountains where he had seen the meteorite strike. In his rearview mirror, the house is a lonely, dark shadow. He has rented this place from Stott, in whose galleries he shows his sculptures. A retreat, Stott called it. It is a wooden one-story affair, L-shaped, its windows long and wide, giving onto views of 50 miles of desert stretching to the foothills in the east and rolling Dunes that conceal the house from the highway to the west. Isolation. Peace. Perfect lighting for his work. The foot of the L is where he has made his studio. Out here, theirs is the only house, there's the only road, and when night closes and he can almost convince himself they are the last people on Earth. The desert surface is smooth, occasional rocks looming out of the night in his headlights, but he drives with caution, steering carefully around them. It is cold in the drafty truck, colder than he had expected, and he is sorry he has not brought his jacket with him. He thinks of Naomi lying in bed alone. Should he have brought Naomi at all, he wonders. When was the last time he sculpted her? They have not really spoken since they arrived, only inconsequential, civil words of no importance. He knows now he shouldn't have mentioned children again, had forgotten the sting of her silences. 2 miscarriages. Not his fault, really. He recognizes the signs, the pattern that plays itself out, a prelude to yet another breakup with her, feels it like a net closing around him. Since arriving, she has been subdued and withdrawn, never entering his studio, showing no interest in his work. Perhaps, he thinks, she is trying to please him, to provide him with the solitude he told her he craved. Yet her manner has the opposite effect, makes him edgy and uncertain, less tolerant than he should be. It is for her he has rented this place, but he cannot bring himself to explain this. Can't she see this? She understands his work has faltered, his ideas dried up, and probably believes they have come for that reason. But he has done it for her. Every day he sits before his sculpting table, but the pieces he executes feel lumpy and awkward under his leaden fingers, stale and unexciting. Sculptures of Naomi. One time they were beautiful. Naomi emerging like a wild and splendid creature from the clay, from the earth and water he kneaded patiently between his fingers. Back then, he believed he felt the way God must have felt, sculpting the first people. Now, most he won't even cast. The desert slides beneath him, a cold, dry plain of hard-packed earth and gravel. The truck skids slightly as he brings it to a stop. In the west, a few miles distant, an orange nimbus is visible above a dark mound. He puts the truck back in gear. Standing on the lip of the crater, he is sweating from the heat of the broken thing that lies almost completely buried, watching its color slowly leaching away into the night as if it were dying. His clothes are dirty and his hands are scratched in half a dozen places. From his scramble up the crater's slope, he squats, uncertain what to do, staring at the thing buried in the sand, at its smooth, machined edges. It is a large cylinder, at least 20 meters in length, though it is hard to tell because its nose is buried. His heart beats quickly. Then he remembers the military range 120 miles to the southeast. A missile, he thinks, just a missile, and his heart settles back into its regular rhythm. He chastises himself for letting his imagination get the better of him, then wipes the sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. He half slides, half walks down the loose debris of the slope, stumbling near the bottom, losing his balance, falling to one knee. Steadying himself against the incline, he rises and curses, shaking the sand from his jeans, and swings around to where he's left his truck. He takes one step, then stops. In the headlights, a figure sits cross-legged. His throat constricts in horror. It is a dream, he thinks, still not believing what has just happened. His clothes lie in a pile next to him, and he stands naked and shivering. In the desert night, he struggles to get his leg into his jeans. Soon, I will wake up. He pulls on his shirt and boots. From the back of the truck, he retrieves an old blanket, and in this he wraps. What? Her, he thinks, remembering the hard, cold ground on his back, the softness of her above, of warm, inhumanly smooth skin against his, of the shape of thighs and breasts and belly, moving and rocking. In time with his motion, knees digging into his sides so hard he had to gasp for breath. The emptiness of impossibly large eyes, black eyes, without irises, like the dark between stars. Or has he only imagined these things? She is completely concealed. In the blanket now. He lifts her, and in his arms she is light, barely there at all. Then she stirs and his heart seems to falter. Quickly he opens the tailgate and places her on the floor next to the spare. He closes the gate, climbs into the driver's seat, and starts the engine. The night speeds towards him as he grips the wheel, the truck flying over ruts and past jagged tongues of rock, his senses still shocked into numbness by that moment, mind agog at what he has done, at what it has made him do. It made me, he tells himself. I was helpless. But he is not sure he believes this, and the Notion brings him little comfort. Yes, a dream. And he seizes on this. Thought as a drowning man would a piece of flotsam, focusing on it until he can almost believe that none of it has happened, that the bundle wrapped in blankets in the back of his truck will not be there. When he gets home, at the far end of the house, attached to the foot of the L, is a small, windowless shed built of graying wood. Its door is secured, with an old padlock for which he could find no key, but in his studio, behind an armoire, he had discovered a low plywood door with a bolt that opened into the shed. He uses the shed as his storeroom, stacking supplies on warped, rickety shelves, bags of terracotta, stoneware and plastiline clays, tins of ferro cement, vinyl concrete, and epoxies, sacks of grog, vermiculite and fiberglass strands, rolls of soft aluminum wire and varied with steel pipes. Now he cleans away a space, struggling with unwieldy sacks and boxes, grunting as he drags them to the side, heaves others onto shelves that creak and complain about the weight. He places an old cotton sleeping bag in the tiny room, moving quietly, afraid of any sound that might intrude upon Naomi's sleep. He feels as if he's slightly drunk, observing his movements from a distance, detached and unafraid, his heart thumping hollowly in his chest, blood singing in his ears, and something else, something unexpected. He has an erection. This thing, she, sits before him, staring at him with open eyes. He is staggered by a wash of desire, barely able to contain his excitement as he stands over her, unable to recall ever feeling this compelling, this desperate an urge. He is intoxicated, and somewhere a small thought troubles him. Why? Why is he doing this? But the puzzlement lingers, only momentarily before it, too, flees to a remote corner of his consciousness, chased there by wave after wave of longing that threatened to drown him. Stepping into the shed, he pulls the door shut after him. Sometime later he closes and bolts the door to the shed. My God, he thinks, what am I doing? His hands tremble, and he can taste his bile rising. He cannot tell Naomi. Not now. Perhaps later. He wants to, and thinks he might, but wonders what he could tell her, what he could possibly say. He burns with shame at this thought, as if it were a hackneyed, commonplace betrayal. But he has betrayed her with what? No, he thinks, I had no choice. It is not the same. No different, he reasons, than if he had been drugged or coerced. He steps into the shower, his body wrapped in a pungent, aromatic scent, like the odor of warm cinnamon. He shivers underneath the spray of the scalding water, thinking of that small form that lies in the back room, recalling suddenly her taste that reminds him of peach, the sensation of his skin pressed against hers, horrified as his body begins once more to respond. He feels his face flush, wonders if she can see his guilt, his fear. Yeah, Fine. I heard you working last night when you got it. Maybe the drive did you some good. His heart bangs fearfully against his ribcage. What did she hear? He wonders. Does she know? Looking away, he bites into a cold slice of toast, chewing it mechanically. He wants to tell her, to show her the thing he has in the back shed. But he is afraid. Of what? Of discovery? Of losing it? I was thinking that maybe we could go away this weekend, she says, leaning against the counter, holding the other grapefruit half in her left hand, paring knife in her right. Book a room in town and see a play or something. No, he thinks. Not now. Not yet. I'd rather not. I just started a new piece, and it's going pretty well. I really don't want to leave it. Right now. He studies her expression, but it's blank. You know the trouble I've been having. She turns back to the sink, laying the grapefruit on the counter, and he can see the muscles beneath her t-shirt bunched. She begins to cut the sections. Couple of weeks from now. Okay. She lifts her shoulders in a shrug. Whatever. Her voice is flat, toneless. He feels as if something has just been closed off from him. Hey, door shut. Tell her, he thinks. She doesn't know? Tell her before she finds out. But instead he drops the crust on his plate, pushes back his chair, its legs scraping across the linoleum. Back to work, he says, and turns towards his studio. 2 days have passed and still he has not told Naomi. He spends most of his waking hours in his studio, working. He tells Naomi, fearing that she sees through him and his lie. But he convinces himself it is not really such a lie, for, to his surprise, he is working. He sculpts her, that small figure concealed in the back shed, though curiously he cannot seem to picture her clearly in his mind. finding that she is a shadow, a dream, indistinct and nebulous when he is not in her presence. But his fingers know her, know the curves and hollows of her body, all the soft lines and angles of her form, know the sensual movement of muscle beneath impossibly smooth skin, surprising himself at the remembered touch. Her skin is cool and smooth as marble, know it far better than his eye ever could, more accurately than his mind could ever imagine. Something has suddenly given way inside him, and each time he kneads and wedges the moist clay on the welding table, he can feel in the formless lump of material her incipient figure, the idea of her impatient to emerge. And when he sculpts, his hands move quickly and with assurance, rolling, pinching and molding as he never has before, the figures almost fashioning themselves without his will, as if the act of surrender is all that is required of him, the ability to lose himself utterly in her. But when he stops, when he no longer has the coolness of wet clay between his fingers, his hands begin to shake, and his mind is filled with nothing but the fact of her, the thing hidden behind the plywood door, the force of it in his studio, feeling its insistent pull, like a tug on his sleeve. A great self-loathing overwhelms him then, making him nauseous, his chest growing heavy, his legs suddenly trembling, and he must leave his studio, if only momentarily, before he collapses beneath the weight of what he has done. During these times he knows Naomi watches him wander through the rest of the house in her mute, dispassionate way, never saying a word to him, responding briefly only when she is spoken to, a sharp silence having opened between them like a wound. He feels the touch of her eyes, judging and condemning him, though when he tries to catch her at it he meets nothing but her disinterested gaze. He hates this, hating himself and Naomi, too, for making him feel humiliation and remorse, for forcing him into pretending nothing is wrong, one moment wishing for her to leave, the next frightened she might, above all fearing the edge of her anger, of what she will do when she finds out. He works and so avoids that moment, leaving the studio only when he feels dizzy with hunger or fatigue beyond endurance, and for those brief times when he loses all sense of himself in that small, dark shed. He remembers an old biology text he sometimes uses for the pictures it has of animals. In it he finds the section for which he's been looking. With his finger he traces the tricolored diagram, a double helix connected by strands, nucleotide bases in pairs, twisted in a familiar pattern, DNA, a genetic blueprint, one that defines physical characteristics, intelligence, sexuality, inherited disorders, and behavior. Does it dictate that as well? He wonders. Can he act in no other way? The boundaries, the book says, are still uncertain, still unclear. Nature and nurture wrapped up in this perplexing strand. She does not eat nor, as far as he can tell, sleep. 3 days now, yet she seems no worse, displays no signs of hunger or fatigue, is always there, waiting for him to open the door. He has proffered her food, but when he returns the plate is always untouched. It is as if she draws all the sustenance she needs from him, from his fires, from those moments in which he immerses himself completely in her. This idea scares him, makes him wonder if she is somehow sucking him dry. He imagines himself as a husk, an empty skin like those the snakes leave scattered in their yard. It is unrestrained desire, addictive, without diffidence or reserve, and now he understands why he must hide her, why he has no choice. She is silent, makes no attempt at communication, at least none he remembers. He has taken to calling her his muse. It is night, and he has left the studio to make himself something to eat, exhausted after working until his back ached and his arms felt as if they were wrapped in a thick layer of the dark, wet clay. He sits on the couch chewing listlessly on a sandwich, thinking of Naomi, who is asleep in their bed, his head heavy and difficult to support, nodding now, drifting in and out of sleep. Then waking, red-eyed sun burning through the window, throbbing in his skull as if he were hung over. He is stiff from where he has slept, half-eaten sandwich in his lap, stomach growling loudly. In the silence of the morning, it is Sunday, he realizes. The weekend has passed and Naomi has said nothing more about going away. Breakfast, he thinks. I'll surprise her. I'll make breakfast for the both of us. Silently he rises, moves towards their room, imagining her caught in the tangle of sheets. But she is not there, and for a moment he is confused. Then he turns, stares at his studio, at the door he always carefully shuts, that now hangs open. He thinks of that tiny plywood door of Naomi. He rushes across the room into the studio, nearly colliding with Naomi as he enters. She backs up a step, Her face is ashen, an expression of shock and revulsion etched on her features, and he looks to the back of his studio, but can see the bolt is still in place. The door shut, no sign that anyone has been into the shed, but knows this means nothing. He turns to her, and for a moment they regard one another, his face coloring, embarrassed at first, then anger rising. Uncertain yet how to react while she stands there, eyes locked on his. "You bastard," she says, twisting the words between her lips as if they poison her tongue. She pushes past him and out the studio while he stands there, angry and confused and fearful. The front door slams and he can hear the truck engine roar to life. Realizing he has moved across the room, now stands with his back to the plywood door, heart hammering in his chest, relief mingling with anger, grateful that the storm had not been as severe as he had expected. She must know, he thinks. Why else would she have left? On the tables around the room, the small gray faces of his work regard him silently. And then he understands. For the first time he sees his work as if through Naomi's eyes. Figures with grotesquely twisted limbs, sagging breasts and engorged genitalia, distended eyes, clawed feet and hands, ravenous, devouring mouths, obscene caricatures of her, of Naomi, of the two of them, together, coupling like wild beasts in the night. For a time he sits alone in the gloom of the empty house on their bed, his clothes caked and stiff with clay, waiting. He does not really believe Naomi will return, but allows himself this hope, convincing himself that he will tell her everything if only she comes back. But she does not. It is too late now, the sun finally gone, hours since she departed. He knows her moods, knows that if she has not returned by now she will not be coming back at all. Briefly, he thinks about his studio, about his work, about that cramped, dark shed. Despite his exhaustion, his body begins to move. In expectation, anticipation, a body no longer his own. A loathing fills him, burning his insides like acid. He pushes away from their bed and stumbles out the door to get away, to put as much distance as possible between himself and that shed. He staggers, stiff-legged, into the night, over the low rolling dunes to the west, away from the mountains, away from the house, pushing one leg before the other, until in the darkness he trips on an outcrop of stone and falls, crying in agony as he tears the skin on palms and cheek against earth that feels like sandpaper. He lies there, unmoving, eyes shut tightly against the pane, mind numb and blank, whimpering in the cool air. Images well up, colliding with one another, whirling slowly round the edge of his understanding, a disorienting jumble of almost seen faces and background lights, a wobbling top about to fall over. He rolls over onto his back, crossing arms over chest, and one image swims to the surface, crowding out everything else. That blazing line of fire, it is so real he believes he is seeing it happen again. Watching it span earth and sky, listening to the muffled impact as it burrows deeply into desert sand. But something is wrong. He sits up and rubs his eyes, thinking that he is not remembering quite right, realizing all at once that he heard no sound that first time, none at all. But he heard it just now, clearly, as if it had struck close by. He pushes himself to his feet and shakes his head to clear it, his mind still fogged, his thoughts confused, looking back in the direction he has just come, towards the house, back to where a yellow nimbus glows in the night. The house, he thinks. He is afraid, recalling that other bloom of light, the one he had seen rising from the crater. His stomach churns with a nauseating fear, and he breaks into a run, scrambling up and down the slopes of dirt and rock and sand in his path, thinking, no, it can't be. A wild, uncontrollable fear pierces his chest like a needle. He is terrified that they have returned, that they will take her back. He runs heedlessly, stumbling and almost falling, driven by fear and rage, the house still out of sight, pausing at the summit of. He tries to see if he can make out what is happening, crying with frustration when he can't. And when he crests the last hill, he stops. Down the road, he sees the familiar taillights of a truck speeding off into the night. Before him, his house burns, throwing a bright dome up to the sky, flames licking the air. As he watches, the big picture window seems to waver momentarily, as if its surface is made of water, then abruptly explodes outwards with a rush of flame. The roof sags, and its splintering beams groan like a dying beast, giving way, caving in, the lone wall of his studio now left. For a moment it hangs there as if supported by an invisible hand. Then it collapses atop the wooden shed, lifting a great flurry of sparks to the sky with A roar, almost masking an unearthly howl that makes his bones crack, and echoes in the empty night. The invasion has begun. He has seen the signs everywhere, in cities large and small, in faces like his. Haunted faces that look away when he tries to catch their eyes. Faces above coveralls and suits and institutional whites. He has studied them, the endlessly replicating patterns of their movements as they follow their own programs while living in the illusion of choice, clocks winding down. The paradigm betrays itself, its purpose, again and again. Stimulus, response, testing of a carefully programmed pattern, an analysis to make sure the genetic transcription is still workable, universal, the end product governed according to its specifications. He has returned to the desert. He squats on the hard, unforgiving earth, behind the trucks. Engine cools, parts drawing tighter, small sounds of complaint. He rises, stares at the cruciform shapes of cacti and humps of distant hills that break and roll towards the mountains. He has driven most of the night, crossing and recrossing the terrain in ever wider patterns, but the crater has disappeared. The papers have reported an unusually high number of meteorites. This summer, he closes his eyes and imagines Naomi. He envisions her naked, and in their bed. In silvered moonlight she is exquisite, perfect, white. Squares of flesh and sharp shadows. His chest constricts abruptly, and for a moment breathing is impossible. He feels dizzy, overcome. Anticipates the rush of blood and excitement, the mounting tension of his hunger for her, for Naomi, a desperate need to possess her. But he is numb, knows he has been programmed to be numb. He releases his breath. There is nothing. No matter how much he thirsts for her, for their lost desire, he regards her serenely, abstractly, as if he were anesthetized, without passion, as if she were a painting or a sculpture, no longer flesh and blood, but as empty as a clod of earth, an inanimate lump of clay. Naomi has fled. He stares at the sky and thinks of that small wooden shed. His heart beats faster, and his desire rises like a swollen river overflowing its banks, threatening to obliterate him. He remembers as if she lay before him now, and he wants to sob. Overhead, the sky is slit open, and a finger of light beckons. To love someone is to isolate him from the world, wipe out every trace of him, dispossess him of his shadow, drag him into a murderous future. It is to circle around the other like a dead star and absorb him into a black light. Jean Baudrillard, Fatal Strategies. The alarm klaxon ululated like a bereaved lover. An arm's length away, a fading circular welt marked the spot where the iris to the command module had once been. I watched the bruise slip through gradations of hue, the characteristic violet of new nanoscaffolding bleeding towards the necrotic gray of the rest of the hull, a time-lapsed wound. Healing over. I blinked and blinked again and lost the afterimage of that meter-wide oval for good. I touched the spot, ran my fingers across the place where the airlock had been. Flawless. I don't understand. Renee's words were barely audible over the alarm. She stared at the skin of the ship, floating there in her rumpled t-shirt and shorts, zero-G buoying her short, dark hair. Beautiful even in the midst of catastrophe. Squinting at the hull, she furrowed her brow, an effort, it seemed, to marshal her thoughts. For Renee, she'd never taken well to stasis. How can we get to the command module? We can't, Beck answered levelly. Hanging onto a grab bar, he looked at the hull dispassionately, one hand draped around the small of Renee's back, drawing her towards him and away from me. It's gone. Although I'd already reached the same conclusion, my stomach nodded at hearing it said aloud. There's no need for a hatch that leads nowhere, Beck continued sonorously, like a judge delivering his sentence. Therefore the ships decided to strengthen the hull. Maybe it's still there, Renee said hopefully. Maybe there was just a rupture in the access tube. No, Beck pointed to the lone display aft in our cramped cabin. It was filled with the frantic yellow glare of dire warnings and flashing red of failures. CES, communications, telemetry, navigation, he said, pulling Renee closer, then wrapping her hand around the bar. It's all offline. Renee was fully awake now. You could see the panic bubbling up in her eyes. She understood what the loss of the command module meant. There was no engine or attitude control and, with the antennae array gone, no way of radioing for help. Not that they would send a rescue ship for 3 lonely souls. Not here, millions of clicks from anywhere. Beck spun around and launched himself towards the stasis cells we recently vacated, catching hold of a grab bar near his locker. Pulling out a static pad, he velcroed it on the bulwark forward of his cell. He opened his duffel and began methodically going through his stuff, examining each item before returning it to the webbed pockets. Inside the duffel or sticking it on the pad, sorting his stuff the way a kid might separate his toys into two piles. At first I thought maybe Beck had flipped out. Christ, I was close to flipping out myself. But then I thought, Beck? No way. He was practically an automaton. If he had any emotions, he'd kept them in his pocket the last 2 years. Of the three of us, he'd be the last to crack. Renee turned to me, looking every bit as scared as I was. Lowry, what are we going to do? I felt a flush of satisfaction. Renee had asked me, not Beck. Only. The satisfaction evaporated just as quickly. I had no answer. All I could do was hang there, feeling stupid and useless and frightened. For a moment I was seized by an irrational desire to wrap my arms around her the way I once did, to comfort her and find my own comfort in return. I felt an excruciating pang of homesickness for her touch, felt nerve endings tingling with imprinted memories of my fingers on her skin, my sweat mingling with hers. I have a plan, Beck answered without turning to face us. His words were a hammer through glass, shattering the moment. I spun around to face him, infuriated. Plan? Of course you have a plan. You always have a fucking plan. Beck paused in his sorting and looked at me, his expression puzzled, as if my anger and fear were an inappropriate response to this situation. Yes, he said simply. Jesus, we don't even know what happened. Meteoroid strike. What? A meteoroid sheared off the command module. He was guessing. You don't know shit. What else could have caused the damage? The damage? He said it as if we were discussing a fender bender. How the hell should I know? Unlikely as it may seem, that's the theory that best fits the observations. What observations? CES is gone, including all the major data stores. We've no records of the impact, if it even was an impact. All we know is the entire command module is gone. Beck pointed to the aft viewport. If you look outside, you'll see we're spinning. Precisely the kind of momentum that would be imparted if something big hit the command module. He pointed to the erstwhile airlock forward. That's the weakest structural point on the shuttle, the place the shuttle would fracture in such an impact. He resumed his sorting, paying me only half a mind. The simplest theory that fits the facts is always the most likely. He paused to look at me. Unless you have a better theory? Beck was silent for a beat. I didn't think so. He turned his back on me again, sticking more stuff on the mat. Thousands of ships have shuttled back and forth to the port cloud. An event like this was inevitable. We should be thankful that we're alive. That's comforting. My sarcasm, as usual, was lost on him. Instead, Beck busied himself going through his toilet kit now, placing selected items, a fallback packet containing pills, a small mirror, a pair of folding scissors, on the static mat, putting others, depilatory gel, aspirin, a small roll of gauze, back in the bag, separating them according to a pattern that only he could appreciate. What the hell was he doing? I pushed away from the hull and floated over, grabbing a bar so that I stopped face to face with him. He glanced at me, then reached into his duffel again. Can you stop that shit for a minute? I seized his wrist and pulled it out of the bag. Beck twisted his arm nonchalantly, breaking my grip as easily as he would have a child's. There's no need to panic, Lowry. He glanced at Renee, his look conveying the slightest hint of sadness. For me, for my unseemly outburst. We have enough life support for 2 days. That only stoked my anger. I let go of the handhold and balled my fists. I wanted to pummel his implacable face until he showed a sign. Any sign of emotion, of anger, of fear, of contrition. Lowry. It was Renee's turn to yell. This isn't going to solve anything. I almost laughed aloud. It seemed even here, even now, the three of us couldn't escape our cliches. Renee moved behind me and grabbed my arm the way I had Beck's, pulling it back. Renee was tall, athletic, blessed with natural grace and strength. I, on the other hand, had always been chosen last for pickup teams. Her fingers pressed deeply into my flesh. I tried not to wince. We need to concentrate on how to get out of this mess, Beck said reasonably, not on what caused it. He's right. Renee drew herself past me, casually catching hold of Beck's arm, not like she had mine, but tenderly. Beck slipped his arm around her waist again. They hung there, their heads almost touching, staring at me, two shiny people, a perfect couple, there. Beauty like a slap in the face. The alarm klaxon howled relentlessly. Lowry, Beck said, releasing Renee and turning back to his locker. Be a good fellow and do something about that hideous noise. Will you? Exactly when he assumed command, I couldn't say. You guess he missed the vote. We left for the stars together, Renee and I. Too young. Engineers, barely out of college, on a romantic adventure. With both of us pulling 2-year contracts, we'd return set for life. I had been swept up in her naive passion, her bright belief in the future. What I had thought was our future. So the stars it was. Only it hadn't turned out that way at all. 11 months after our arrival at Alpha L Station, everything fell apart. Another stupid argument had us avoiding each other for a week. Not a simple feat on a cramped station built to house only a couple of hundred people. To be honest, I can't even remember why we'd fought in the first place. When she'd broken the ice, inviting me for dinner, I'd assumed it was to apologize. I'd been prepared for a tearful reconciliation and, later, the satisfying warmth of a shared bed. But after a gloomy dinner in a tiny common area, replete with long stretches of awkward silences and furtive looks, she averted her eyes, neatly folded and refolded her used napkin, poked the largely uneaten piece of pie on her plate with her fork. All evening she had talked in an offhand way about us, circling round and round the topic of our relationship like a carrion bird, waiting, I suppose, for the last bleary-eyed miner to leave us alone. The moment he was gone, she alighted. This isn't going anywhere, she said, putting down her fork and frowning. No, I answered, thinking she meant the long-forgotten point of contention. If you weren't so damn stubborn. I've met someone else. I felt like I'd smashed into a wall. She spoke some more, but nothing she said registered. An eye blink later, or so it seemed, I was standing outside the door to her cubby, not sure how we'd even gotten there. Hey, no hard feelings. The station is too small for that. Okay, Lowry? There was a crumb of pie crust on her upper lip that I wanted to brush off. Okay. I guess I was in shock, because I took a step forward, an automatic gesture, moving towards the rumpled sheets of her bed, as I had on so many other occasions. Only this time she straight-armed me, her palm slamming into my sternum, making me gasp and stagger backwards. Although the resulting bruise was tender for weeks, what hurt more was the way her beautiful sculpted features twisted into an unmistakable look of disgust before she swung the door shut in my face. I remember stumbling down the corridor back to my own miserable little cubby, thinking she'll come round, but knowing in my heart it was a comfortless lie. We were alone, Beck having retreated to the aft propulsion module after ordering us to go through our lockers and all the other lockers in the cabin, of which there were a considerable number, and add anything that might contain metal to his mat. It's pointless, I said to Renee. She ignored me and continued to root through her locker, as Beck had instructed her, occasionally adding something to the items on the mat. Did you hear me? Renee separated her stuff carefully, methodically. I heard you, Lowry. Now shut up and get to work. Doesn't it bother you that we're going to die? I asked. Life support is in the green. Propulsion is still online, as are most of the attitude and articulation subsystems. Renee parroted Beck's earlier pronouncements tonelessly, like a mantra, not looking at me. Useless without nav? She looked up, her duffel open and in her hand. We can reconstitute any command systems we need, including the NAV computer, using the GPD. I glanced at the aft hatch. Beck was back there, playing around with the GPD, our general-purpose assembler/disassembler, a series of interconnected tubs secured near the tertiary engine shield. Inside was an array of tiny seeds, nanomachines that could, in theory, rebuild any of the command/data systems, in lieu of the triply redundant systems that had been swept away with the command module. We still had the GPD. All we had to do was program the request and feed in the right kind of raw material. That was why Beck had us sorting through this stuff to see if we had the requisite molecules. But I knew it was a vain, foolish hope. As foolish as my belief had been that Renee would someday return to me. Won't work. That's your response to everything, Renee snapped. If you want to lie down and die, go ahead. Just don't dig a grave for me. I'm only being realistic. Pessimistic is more like it. I shrugged. God knows how far off course we are. Even if we get the NAV computer back, we still have to feed it navigational data. The antennae arrays went with the command module, and we don't have the material to reconstitute them. Most of what we have here is carbon-based. Even if we could find enough metal for the antennae, there's no way of installing and calibrating them. So scratch any hope of communication and navigational data. I hadn't bothered pointing this out to Beck. I smirked, and it struck me that I was smirking not only at Beck's oversight but at the certainty of my own death. We've got optics. It won't be perfect, but it doesn't need to be, as long as we can get back to where we're likely to be spotted. I'd completely forgotten about optics, but Beck hadn't. I felt foolish. Nav could plot a course based solely on optical sightings. It had hard-coded star maps. Once the optical data was loaded into memory, like a guttering candle, that hope flickered and died. The NAV computer, like other essential control systems, was radiation-hardened for the rigors of a long haul. It used good old-fashioned ferrite core memory. The GPAD would require only micrograms, but I doubted there were even trace amounts of iron or iron-bearing alloys on the shuttle. Iron and steel were too unwieldy, too heavy for space. There were far better, cheaper, and more efficient materials available. Materials like those used in the skin of the ship, hundreds of times harder than diamond. Who the hell used iron for anything anymore? I watched Renee sort through her clothes, examining buttons and clasps and zippers. Beck was smart. Smart enough to have figured this out, too. Why hadn't he told Renee? Was he trying to shield her from despair as long as possible? That wasn't like him, and it wasn't right to hide it from her. It's no good, I said. We don't have enough